Well, good evening, everyone. Glad you're here again. And we have come to the 8th and final evening. And we are looking this evening at joining the peace procession, challenging the collaboration between religion and violence. We have picked up a number of themes from Luke's Gospel and have tried to read them very much from a socio-political perspective and context. I think we all struggle with the history of violence and war, and our struggle intensifies when we acknowledge what seems to be the collaboration between religion and violence. Religion and violence seem to go together in much of history. It is easy, I suppose, to identify those terrible historical moments when religion and war, religion and violence collude and collaborate in appalling destruction of life and property and the environment. The Abrahamic religions account for the majority of religious adherents on the planet, and it seems many of the violent conflicts and wars. We have Joshua's holy wars in the Hebrew Bible, the call to jihad cited literally from the Quran, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the immediate post-Reformation's 30 Years' War, and other European wars of religion. More could be added. Going back behind the Abrahamic traditions, military force and religion were essential to the state, but even from these very early times, there were those who struggled and tried to find ways in their religions to counter these aggressive and violent human urges and redirect humans into more peaceful ways. Pre-modern or modern, there often seems to be a close connection between religion and violence. In Ireland, the Williamite Wars of the late 17th century are remembered, at least in Ireland, as a violent confrontation between Protestants and Catholics. The Protestant victory is ever contemporary for some. A century ago in Ireland, as Protestant and Catholic armed and prepared for violence and conflict, ultimate trust was placed by both sides in God, who had stood by or delivered our fathers in the past. The churches were ambiguous, to say the least, often identified with the respective causes, which were acquiring arms and guns and becoming violent and brutal in the latter part of the crucial decade 1912 to 1922. Today, in memorialization, churches play a central role as the dead, described as making the supreme sacrifice, which is very powerful religious terminology. They are remembered through religious ritual. The religions themselves shape the memorial liturgies and rituals. And even in a more secular age, religion plays a powerful public role when the state remembers its dead. Especially in more militarized societies where mindsets have been shaped by militarism and military traditions, many have no problem with the collaboration between religion and war and violence. Others are uneasy but find it difficult to voice any moral critique of either the militarized worldview or the theology and vision of God associated with it. Although the close connection between religion and violence and war may dominate in some societies, it has never been the only or the whole story. It has been said that religion, like the weather, does lots of things. Karen Armstrong has put it this way: in religious history, the struggle for peace has been just as important as the Holy War. Religious people have found all kinds of ingenious methods of dealing with the assertive machismo of the reptilian brain, curbing violence and building respectful, life-enhancing communities. We may think that human beings have a natural propensity for violence and killing each other. Humans do kill more of their own kind than any other species of its kind. Yet humans also heroically and courageously build peace. And Armstrong's book is a corrective to the view that faith is violent and shows how religious ideas and movements have opposed war and aggression and worked for equality and peace and reconciliation. It is perhaps not true to say that religion is inherently violent. Armstrong points to the diametrically opposed courses of action taken in the Hebrew Bible. Quote, in the Hebrew Bible, the Deuteronomists and the priestly authors all meditated on the same stories, but the Deuteronomists turned violently against foreign peoples, while the priestly authors sought reconciliation. The Deuteronomists, with their strand of religiously inspired violence, underlies Joshua's campaign of genocide. But the most devastating critique of it, and alternative vision of justice and peace, comes from the Hebrew prophet Hosea. It may be that the Lucan community in 1890 CE was struggling with this huge moral tension. The Roman Empire dominates everything. Between 65 and 70 CE, Jewish paramilitaries had risen against the empire. The Roman military had responded with imperial military might and utterly crushed not only the Jewish paramilitaries, but many thousands and thousands of Jewish people. The innocent perished, survivors were scattered throughout the Mediterranean world, and the temple and the holy city of Jerusalem destroyed. It was described as the first Holocaust, a catastrophe. Some of the Lucan community may have been survivors and are now living elsewhere as the diaspora. The Jewish-Roman War had happened only 10 years earlier, or 20 at most. Memories were raw, trauma was real, and even as diaspora, there was nowhere outside the mighty Roman Empire. And the Lucan faith community itself is mixed, it's diverse, it's made up of Jews and other ethnic groups, wealthy and poor, women and men. Now, groups and associations in the Greco-Roman world were not like that. The radical inclusivity of the Lucan community could find not only tensions within, but tensions between itself and the wider community. What was the relationship between the faith community and the Greco-Roman world and its dominating imperialism? It used to be thought that Luke's Gospel and Acts were a political apologetic for the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, that Luke was writing to a faith community, putting a more benign faith on the empire. It was thought perhaps that he was conveying a message that the empire was not too bad after all. It may even be good for you. Buy into the peace of the empire and be at peace with the empire. Don't be a community of resistance, and there is no need to be all that alternative, especially with that terrible war just a decade ago. If Luke was writing such an apologetic for the Pax Romana and the empire, it might have been understandable. If a community of faith wanted to make living with empire more comfortable, who could blame them? But the idea that Luke was writing a political apologetic for the empire overlooks the persistent presentation of justice by Luke. Luke writes about justice in a way that goes beyond the justice of the religious authorities and the grasp of the Roman political masters. Luke's social ethic of Jubilee, pervading the manifesto and program of action for Jesus and therefore the church, was action for socio-economic justice that took the poor and marginalized out of their poverty and brought them back into community with dignity and a share in the common good. But his constant use of the word dikaios or dikaiosune suggests that this is a special area of interest and praxis for Luke. There is no cozying up to Rome, but a radical alternative vision of human community beyond the comprehension of Rome. It was no less than a Roman centurion, a military leader in charge of the state execution of Jesus, who made a confession that was treasonous in the eyes of the empire. Mark and Matthew told the story as, truly this was the Son of God. Luke had those two manuscripts in front of him, and he changed Mark and Matthew's agreed text. In Luke, the confession became, truly this was a just man. The New Revised Standard Version English has innocent man, but Luke in the whole section is not talking about innocent people, but about righteous or just people. The word is dikaios, meaning just. The Romans had executed a just person who had embodied social and inclusive justice in a way the empire never could. And Luke has that affirmed by one of the empire's military leaders. In various forms, Luke uses justice 12 times, and none of those 12 usages have any parallel in Mark and Matthew. An author with that much justice in his gospel is not trying to go softly on the empire and Pax Romana, nor is he saying the Lucan community can accommodate their program of action to the Roman cultural, social, political, and economic norms. It was not easy being the Lucan faith community at the end of the first century. But Luke and the community were struggling to know what faith action meant and how they were to be and live in the context of empire. Without justice, there is no peace. Well, the Romans had a slogan a bit like that. The emperor was the Lord and Savior of the whole world, bringing justice and peace through victory and conquest and military might. Luke turns all of that upside down. Might is not right, or in Luke's key word, just. Justice and peace do not come through victory and conquest. Every empire in history has deluded itself in thinking that, and every war fought has believed that military victory would bring justice and peace. But when has that happened? It didn't happen through the Roman Empire, and it didn't happen after 1918 and 1945, whatever myths of victory nation states and empires created. Luke almost bookends his gospel with peace. An army of angels sings peace on earth in the presence of shepherds. We join that Lucan community hymn in Luke chapter 2. In Luke 19, verses 28 to 40, we join a peace procession and another open-air songs of praise, of peace, as Jesus goes public in the streets of volatile Jerusalem. The church makes much of Palm Sunday and what we call the triumphant entry to Jerusalem. But Luke is telling a story to let a faith community know what its program of action is. How did they hear this story of Jesus entering Jerusalem on a donkey, leading a peace procession and singing songs of peace? We'll stop there, and Loretto can put it into rooms. There are a couple of questions that might enable discussion. How do we respond? We can't escape this one, I think, but how do we respond to the trenchant, often trenchant criticism of the role of religion in violence and war? And the second, Luke's major area of concern and praxis was justice. How should justice be a major concern and praxis for the contemporary faith community? Okay, we'll take 20 minutes there and then come back and have an open conversation. Enjoy. Let's look at what do I call a peace procession and not a military parade. Luke writes a block in his gospel as a journey narrative. And that narrative is found, it begins in Luke chapter 9, verse 51, and it runs through to chapter 19, verse 44. And it does seem with clear intent that Luke places the peace theme at the beginning and the end of that journey narrative. Luke wants the community of faith to know that Jesus' purpose and work was in bringing peace, and having located the gospel from the very beginning, chapter 2, at the heart of the Roman Empire, the peace Jesus is for is different to the Pax Romana. The alternative peace is the work and practice of the faith community in its socio-political context. And Luke's journey narrative comes to an end with a peace procession. Now, a procession into the city was a familiar scene in the first century. In a Greco-Roman entry procession, the ruler or the conqueror was escorted into the city by the citizens or by the victorious army. There was much singing of victory hymns or acclamations, and a triumphant Roman procession had much symbolism, making clear the authority of the ruler. There was a ritual act of sacrifice in the temple as the ruler symbolically claimed the city. And this was exactly how Jewish historian Josephus described Alexander the Great's entry into Jerusalem, and how the Greek writer Plutarch described Antony's triumphant entry into Ephesus. And the brothers Maccabees had entered Jerusalem in a similar triumphant procession after defeating the Seleucids and gaining Jewish independence. So there is a familiar pattern to the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. Now, if we want the palm branches, then we need to read John. If we want to hear loud hosannas, then we go to Mark and Matthew. Luke doesn't bother with these details. Luke's pageant, it has been said, is political, as any witnessing it would have realized. This is a political act with political intent, and it is politically subversive, setting out a peace that is a radical alternative to that proclaimed by the Roman Empire. It is a staged procession, and everything about it intimates the symbolic character of this act. So the triumphant entry to Jerusalem, as we call it, is a piece of dramatic street theatre, provocative, subversive, alternative. And the Jewish crowd would have recognized the symbolic nature of the entry. The Hebrew prophets did this kind of thing frequently. Jeremiah bought a field as a future investment, symbolizing hope for a future for his community. Ezekiel tended to eccentricity and acting bizarrely. He lay down in the town centre for days, stark naked, to symbolize the coming disaster for his community, which would strip them of everything. These were political acts described later by scholars as prophetic symbolism. And Jesus was in this prophetic tradition. And what we call Palm Sunday was an act of prophetic symbolism. The crowd in the city, and the Romans as well as the temple priests, got the political point. Peace is not inner feelings. Peace is political, and it is either achieved through victory and conquest or through social and political justice. That was the dramatic point of the procession led by Jesus in Jerusalem. Luke's narrative is set at the beginning of Passover week, when Jewish pilgrims flocked from all over the then world for the central Jewish festival. Now, this was not merely a religious festival, it was politically loaded. Passover was the great remembering of the liberation from Egyptian political and economic slavery, the Exodus. It was the people's foundational myth, remembered annually with a whole week of festivities in Jerusalem. Feelings ran high. The political, economic, and military domination system under which the people lived was Roman. And every Passover week in Jerusalem raised the temperature and the thoughts and longings for liberation and freedom. Now, the Romans were aware of this political theology of liberation, which is why they drafted extra troops into Jerusalem for the week. The Jews came to the Passover with heightened thoughts and aspirations of Roman defeat and Jewish liberation. And the Romans packed the city with military presence, intent on keeping the lid on any revolution and maintaining security and domination. The Romans would keep the peace. On the opening day of Passover, use the imagination. On the opening day of Passover, two processions entered the city. From the west gate came the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, leading a column of imperial cavalry and soldiers. Pilate led the military procession on his war horse. It was a very clear message. It proclaimed the power of empire to maintain the Pax Romana. From the east gate came another procession, peasants, led by Jesus on a donkey, the symbol of peace, with the poor and the peasants singing songs of peace that no doubt echoed the Jewish people's liberation from an earlier empire. One was a military procession, the other a peace procession. Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan put it this way: Pilate's military procession was a demonstration of both Roman imperial power and Roman imperial theology. The contrast was stark. Again, they write, Jesus' procession proclaimed the kingdom of God. Pilate's procession proclaimed the power of empire. The two processions embody the central conflict of the week that led to Jesus' crucifixion. One procession is about the Roman Empire. The other is about the radical alternative empire of God. There are two opposing theologies here. Empire or domination system always has its underlying and legitimizing theology. Might is right, power over is victory, security is peace, and peace comes through victory and conquest and domination. The theology of the empire of the kingdom of God is very different. It is peace through justice. And look, as with the Hebrew prophets and the core theme of the Hebrew Bible, holds justice and peace together in his gospel. It is a biblical theology in action that is in opposition to, subversive of, an alternative to the public theology of empire and domination systems. It is public resistance theology. Luke underscores this by quoting two texts from the Hebrew Bible, the tradition of ancient Israel, to which the Jesus narrative and the faith and praxis of the Lucan community belong. His two texts are Psalm 118 and the prophet Zechariah, chapter 9 and verse 9. Psalm 118 blesses the King who comes in the name of the Lord. It is the acclamation of the representative of the ultimate who will rule in justice and peace. Luke has already alluded to this psalm in the Song of the Peace Army and the Shepherds in chapter 2 of his Gospel. Zechariah is all about symbolism, a king coming to Jerusalem not on a horse, the symbol of war, but on a donkey, the symbol of peace. Luke, in quoting Zechariah 9, verse 9, assumes that his readers will familiarize themselves with the context and the rest of the prophet. Zechariah is set in the context of the Persian Empire, and the resistance to imperial power is the prophet's point as a Jerusalem community struggles with the tensions between resistance and accommodation in the late 6th century. The theology and praxis is to be different. And so Zechariah 9, verse 10, he will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. Borg and Crossan summarize. This king, riding on a donkey, will banish war from the land. No more chariots, war horses, or bows. Commanding peace to the nations, he will be the king of peace. So from the west gate of Jerusalem comes Pilate with his cavalry, embodying the power, glory, and violence of an empire that ruled the world. And from the east gate comes Jesus, deliberately countering Pilate with a procession embodying an alternative vision, an alternative empire, a kingdom of God, a kingdom of non-violence and justice and peace. Now, perhaps the Lucan community was in danger of forgetting or going thin on their purpose and praxis in the real historical and political world. Luke is challenging and reminding them what they are for. On the matter of Luke's agenda, Levine and Witherington say, on the matter of Luke's agenda, we recognize that the Gospel and Acts provide Christianity what is needed toward the end of the 1st century. Between 80 and 90 CE, a community of faith was struggling, as all faith communities do, in differing contexts, to live out with some fidelity their commitment together to the purpose of God as they had become aware of it through this person, Jesus. There were lots of pressures and tensions, not only between the community and the life and values of the dominating world in which they lived, but pressures and tensions also within the faith community. Relationships were divided between wealthy and poor, Jews, Greeks, Samaritans, and other ethnic groups. Divisions between women and men, issues of gender injustice, social and economic injustice, and racial ethnic injustice. Maybe the faith community wasn't much different from the wider society. Their vision of the world that their faith had given them clashed with the vision of the world imposed by the empire. They lived with these clashing worldviews, clashing theologies, because theology was not really a set of doctrines or dogmas to be believed, but a vision of life in the world and a program of action and praxis. How were they to live and be in the Roman Empire as citizens of the empire of God? This is what a gospel was trying to address. Luke, as we said at the very beginning of this study, 8 weeks ago or so, Luke was not writing a life or biography of Jesus. He was writing to a community of faith, trying to help them see what faithful praxis was in the empire of God, in the life of the world. This is how we have been trying over these sessions to read and reflect on Luke's gospel. As people of faith struggling to live in our 21st century world, post-COVID, Brexit, social and economic inequalities, uncertainties perhaps about the future of the United Kingdom, about the future of the island of Ireland, the geopolitical shifts worldwide, the threat of global conflict, the biggest threat of all, the climate crisis and destruction of the environment. What is our purpose and praxis in the world? Faith can opt out, in which case it's not faith. Theology is lived public theology, a program of action. How has Luke challenged us? The other focus over these weeks has been on recovering the social foundations of the common good. We might have described this as recovering the moral foundations of the common good. The common good is the good life shared by all. Early in the book of Acts, Luke described the community of faith as having all things in common. And this in Acts was very much about economics, shared power, and relationships of solidarity. These are the themes of his gospel also. Hymn singing in the Lucan community joined Mary singing for a social revolution, and also sang a short hymn by Simeon of all of this as common and God's universal concern. Luke's community was to sing and act as an army of peace and join a subversive procession for a peace rooted in non-violence and socio-economic justice. Social and economic inequality block the common good, and Luke challenged the faith community on inequality. Patriarchy and gender injustice also block the common good, but Luke and the Lucan community, as we saw, still had an ambiguity around gender justice. But at the same time, for Luke, there is no common good without social inclusion. Religion is not about institutional forms and proposition and doctrinal formulations, still less the collusion with violence, which is the dark shadow side of religious history. Religion and theology are providing a vision for life and living, a way of being and praxis. Theology is public theology, a program of action, a pursuit of the common good and goodness. In Luke, we have encountered the social and moral foundations of the common good, which is local and global. Today, it is a planetary common good. And these foundations are social solidarity, social inclusion, equality, socio-economic and gender justice, and peace rooted in justice and non-violence. These were the moral and social foundations for the Lucan faith community's program of action in the life of the world. This is faith in public action for the common good. We'll go to rooms again for another 20 minutes, and I suppose there is a question there. How has Luke challenged us? And maybe if justice and peace together are for Luke social or moral foundations for the common good, what is the role of the faith community in Ireland and the world today for that common good? Okay, have a good discussion for about 20 minutes.